Уважаемые коллеги, пожалуйста, рассаживайтесь. Мы начинаем нашу работу. Уважаемые коллеги, дорогие друзья, гости, позвольте мне от лица Русского общества истории, философии и науки поприветствовать вас на Первом конгрессе, который мы организуем в Москве. Мы очень рады тому, что в нашем конгрессе участвуют такие замечательные люди, представляющие много стран, много университетов, научно-образовательных центров. И мы очень рады, что вы приняли наше приглашение. Я уверен, что своего рода зона обмена, используя известный термин Питера Галлисона и Гарри Коллинза, которую мы организуем на этой конференции, породит много интересных идей в рамках интенсивного культурного и научного взаимодействия. И, среди прочего, будет способствовать упрочению международного сотрудничества в области истории, философии и науки. Я желаю всем ярких, интересных дискуссий и надеюсь, что все мы получим большое удовольствие от этого конгресса. В настоящий момент, коллеги, давайте друг друга поприветствуем. В настоящий момент, по моим данным, более 200 участников зарегистрированы. Они представляют собой целый ряд стран. Это Беларусь, Германия, Греция, Россия, Украина, Великобритания, Соединенные Штаты Америки. Люди подходят, возможно, количество увеличится. Большая честь для нас приветствовать здесь высококвалифицированных ученых в области философии и смежных наук, среди которых есть немало и известных людей во всем мире. И в особенности мы признательны нашим приглашенным докладчикам, keynote speakers, и приглашенным лекторам, invited lectures, что они приняли наше приглашение и прибыли, многие даже издалека. Весь замысел конференции никогда бы не был реализован, если бы не мощная поддержка целого ряда организаций и личностей. Я перечислю только некоторые, самые важные из них. Это Институт философии Российской академии наук, философский факультет Московского государственного университета, Российский научный фонд, Российский фонд фундаментальных исследований и Ассоциация российских банков. Всем им наша глубокая признательность. И мы также признательны Американскому обществу по социальным исследованиям науки за информационную поддержку нашего мероприятия. Дорогие коллеги, в течение первого дня и третьего дня нашего конгресса все вы будете гостями Института философии Российской академии наук. Поэтому, как вы понимаете, именно Институт философии, как самый главный спонсор, и сделал возможным это мероприятие. Поэтому позвольте мне передать микрофон директору Института философии, академику Андрею Вадимовичу Смирнову для приветственного слова.
Dear guests, esteemed colleagues, it is my honor and my privilege to welcome you on behalf of the Institute of Philosophy, Russian Academy of Sciences, here at this first Congress of the Russian Society for History and Philosophy of Science. I will say a few words in Russian, and then I will switch back to English. Дорогие друзья, дорогие коллеги, я рад приветствовать вас от имени Института философии на этом знаменательном событии. Это первый конгресс, насколько я понимаю, правильно, Илья Теодорович? Это первый конгресс Российского общества истории и философии науки. Это не случайное мероприятие. Оно является результатом целого ряда шагов, которые были предприняты в последнее время. Но и в целом, конечно, это закономерное завершение, не завершение, а закономерный этап той линии развития философии науки, эпистемологии науки, которая на протяжении многих десятилетий наблюдается в Институте философии. И сегодня, если мы оглядываемся назад, мы, конечно, не можем не вспомнить тех, кто развивал это направление и на чьи исследования, на чьи усилия мы опираемся. И если назвать только некоторые имена, это не исчерпывающий список, конечно, мы не можем не вспомнить, если мы говорим о философии науки, мы не можем не вспомнить имена. Кто-то с нами, кого-то уже нет, но тем не менее я их перечислю. Регина Семеновна Карпинская, Виталий Георгиевич Горохов, Игорь Константинович Лисеев, Елена Аркадьевна Мамчур, Владимир Иванович Аршинов, Андрей Юрьевич Севальников, Владимир Григорьевич Буданов, Борис Григорьевич Юдин, Павел Дмитриевич Тищенко и многие-многие другие. Это не исчерпывающий список. Я прошу прощения, если я кого-то не назвал. Это не исчерпывающий список, это только отдельные имена, которые представляют и целые направления, сектора в Институте философии, которые занимались философией естествознания, биологии, физики, астрономии, космологии и так далее, и так далее. Мы, конечно, не можем не вспомнить также и те исследования, которые велись с другой стороны. Вот те, кого я назвал, по преимуществу представляют ту линию философии науки, которая представлена учеными, получившими прежде всего естественно-научное образование и пришедшими в философию, поскольку философия науки по самой своей природе – это область междисциплинарная, которая требует очень хорошего профессионального знания и конкретных наук, и философии. А это вот те, кто пришел со стороны конкретных, естественных наук. Но мы не можем не вспомнить и тех, кто внес свой вклад в эту область и кто пришел в нее со стороны профессиональной философии. Это, конечно, и Владислав Александрович Лекторский, академик Российской академии наук, который среди всего спектра тех проблем, которыми он занимался в философии науки, также занимает достойное место. Он многое сделал для развития этого направления в России. Вот совсем недавно мы здесь в институте презентовали русский перевод книги профессора Агаци как раз по этой же тематике, по методологии науки, философии науки. Илья Теодорович Касавин также, я чуть позже подробнее скажу об этом, представляет это направление. И, конечно, академик Степин, Владислав Семенович Степин, который так удачным образом совмещал эти две линии, собственно, даже с момента своего университетского образования, так сказать, естественно-научную, физическую и философскую. Все мы знаем его концепцию классической, постклассической рациональности, которую он развивал и в отношении философии науки, собственно, и далее он распространил ее на другие области, включая философию культуры. Причем я хочу сказать, что сегодняшнее событие – это такой закономерный, я думаю, результат этих многих десятилетий развития этого направления в Институте философии. Илья Теодорович Касавин, который уже много лет возглавляет сектор социальной эпистемологии, также внес очень серьезный, существенный вклад в это направление. Он организовал и возглавляет очень удачный, хороший журнал «Философия и эпистемология науки», который получил признание и в международных базах данных, и в котором публикуется. Я уверен, что все вы его знаете, и все вы или почти все были его авторами или будете его авторами. Он возглавил огромную работу по созданию энциклопедии «Эпистемология и философия науки». Вот огромный том, который вышел. Я надеюсь, что эта работа будет продолжена силами, может быть, вашего общества. Масса публикаций по этой тематике, очень хорошая школа молодых, но уже и зрелых сотрудников в этом секторе работает, которые работают в этом направлении и в области философии языка, что тесно смыкается с аналитической философией, и в области, собственно, философии науки. Вот, поэтому сегодняшний конгресс – это знаменательное событие, и, конечно, для Института философии это очень важное событие. И я думаю, что вот такое поступательное движение от учредительных конференций Российского общества истории, философии, науки, которое состоялось практически 2 года назад на философском факультете, вот до этого первого конгресса, я надеюсь, что и дальше будет очень хорошее поступательное движение. Ну, а что касается, собственно, научной составляющей, то я уверен, что она будет на самом высоком уровне, учитывая уровень докладчиков и участников, и зарубежных, и российских. И я желаю вам успешной и плодотворной работы. Позвольте, я скажу несколько слов для наших зарубежных гостей. Dear guests, dear participants, welcome you again in the Institute of Philosophy. I would like to extend my deep gratitude to you for coming here and for sharing with us your thoughts and considerations on the history and philosophy of science. In my introductory remarks, I sketched briefly the history of the philosophy of science in Russia in general and in the Institute of Philosophy, mentioning some outstanding names in that field. And also I spoke about the importance of the work done by Ilya Kasavin, Professor Kasavin, who is the head of the Russian Society for History and Philosophy of Science in that field. So thank you again, welcome you again, and I wish you all a very fruitful and successful work at this Congress. Thank you.
Теперь я позволю себе тоже, если хотите, представить академика Смирнова. Вот небольшая презентация, посвященная его трудам. А теперь мы переходим к основным докладам на первом пленарном заседании. В первого доклада выступит Роберт Эванс из университета Кардифф. Автор Гарри Коллинс этот доклад. К сожалению, Гарри может некоторым обстоятельствам присутствовать здесь, но он передает всем горячий привет. Название доклада «Популизм и наука», а вот краткая презентация соавторов, подготовивших этот доклад. Я указал здесь только те работы, которые некоторые из тех важнейших работ, которые опубликованы ими в соавторстве. Как вы понимаете, работ у этих двух авторов, чрезвычайно известных, мне даже неудобно говорить о каких-то индексах Хирша, они слишком высокие, очень много. Ну вот, Гарри Коллинс, я бы упомянул, он является соавтором сильной программы в социологии научного знания вместе с Блуром и Барнсом. В 70-е годы это была плеяда замечательных людей, которые начинали это движение. А теперь я представляю слово Роберту Эвансу.
I would like to give the floor to you. Okay. So you're welcome.
Как вы видите, у нас две презентации. Одна оригинальная будет, значит, с этой стороны, а перевод такой краткий будет вот с этой стороны.
Well, I'd like to begin just by thanking Professor Cassidy for the invitation to present our work here. It's a great honour to be here, so thank you very much for inviting me. So the microphone up again, yeah. Okay, is that any better? Okay, so all you missed was me thanking Professor Cassavin for the invitation to present my work here, the work that me and Harry are doing here. It's a great honour to be here. Okay, so the paper itself puts forward ideas that to some extent are still under development, but hopefully they will speak to the broader conference theme of history and philosophy of science in a time of change. It certainly feels like a time of change in the UK, and to some extent that's what we're trying to pick up on in this paper. Okay. In preparation for coming here, we were asked to provide a copy of the paper. I'm not sure who has had access to that paper and who's seen it and who hasn't. So just by way of warning, the presentation that I'm about to give differs slightly from that paper. The main way in which it differs is there's much more preamble and background and introduction to this presentation than there is to the actual paper version itself. And that's mainly because when I practiced giving this paper before I came, the question that everybody said was, you need more introduction. It doesn't make sense if you just launch straight into it. So before we get to the bit that was in the paper that I submitted back in July, there's some more background and context about where, in terms of thinking in science and technology studies, the arguments that I'm going to put forward come from. So there's a little bit about, in order to motivate what is there, about what we mean when we say democracy and what we mean when we say populism. And the way in which we get there is by thinking through sociologically the nature of a social group, and allowing us to identify some sort of common or core characteristics. And to sort of anticipate where we're going with this, one of the things that we say defines the difference between democracy and populism, because we'll see they can sort of shade each other, is the attitude they take to pluralism, with democracy being rather more relaxed about pluralism and populism being much keener on eliminating it. Then we get to the sort of the core STS stuff, which is really how do we, as analysts of science, understand what makes science distinctive from other ways of producing knowledge. In particular, we focus on the values of science rather than the epistemology of science, and use that as the basis of an argument for why we should value science, and in particular argue that it functions as one of the system of checks and balances within a democratic society, and that's really its most important role, and that's the way in which we would like to defend its contribution to democracy, and also to see it as a bulwark against the rise of populism. And then to finish off then, we think briefly about the sort of the practical implications of this. And again, fairly sociologically, the argument is that if we see democracy like science as a kind of practice and as a kind of culture, then in order to defend science and defend democracy, this is not merely a matter of top-down disseminating ideas, it's a matter of bottom-up actually living the practices, walking the walk, rather than just talking the talk. So that's roughly where we're going to try and go over the next 30 or 40 minutes. I will leave time at the end for questions. Okay, so just in terms of the background and context, so you're one slide ahead of me, aren't you? Okay, now we're back in sync. To start with the wider and political context, this is the sense in which it seems to me and Harry that there is something changing, certainly in American and European democracies. I mean, at one level, it's clear there's always been populist elements in these. Oops, sorry, gone too far now. Don't follow me. I've pressed the wrong button. I've lost the screen notes. There's always been populist elements in our society. What we're saying has changed, I suppose, is the prominence and the kind of mainstreaming of those those arguments and those positions within these societies. And the slide just illustrates a number of these events that have happened in the UK, other European democracies, and America. So in UK, the Brexit referendum is a big thing for us, but you've also got the rise of the Freedom Party in Austria, similar parties in Holland and Germany. You've got the Five Star Movement in Italy. You've got increasingly authoritarian presidents in place in Hungary and Turkey, and the most sort of egregious example, if you like, of the way in which this rise to populism leads to challenges to not just the status quo in terms of elite institutions, but to expertise and scientific expertise in particular, is obviously the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States. So I think what we're saying is that there is a sense in which things are changing, but what I want to try and focus on in this talk is the extent to which any of this is a concern for or relevant to us in our kind of professional role. I mean, clearly, as citizens in these countries or in these neighboring countries, we might have a view about whether or not this is a good or bad thing. But I want to focus specifically on our professional role as analysts in some sense of the scientific endeavor or scientific institutions. Does the rise of these populist, more authoritarian sentiments in the wider society have any role for us professionally? I want to argue that it does. And the purpose of this presentation, I guess, is then to show how this might be the case, how we might cash this out and argue that as scholars of science, people who understand what science is, how science works, we have a particular contribution to make to this debate that goes beyond our role merely as citizens in that society. Okay. At one level, I suppose this is not a new argument. The position that we're setting out now was first published best part of 15 years ago, or just over 15 years ago, in the paper that's highlighted on the slide there, the Third Wave of Science Studies paper that Harry and me co-authored. And that paper makes a number of points, really. The first thing, I guess, that's important to state in a philosophy context is that it accepts the social constructionist description of science associated with science and technology studies. So in that sense, it's not in any way at all defending a realist depiction of science. It's not defending a realist epistemology. It's not defending a realist philosophy of science. In fact, it's taking a position that's quite contrary to those. So it might be controversial in that sense. Within STS, I guess its more controversial status comes from the fact that despite explicitly starting from this social constructivist position and accepting that this is how science actually works, it then goes on to argue that expertise is real and not just a status, not just a matter of attribution. And it also goes on to make a distinction between technical and political phases in technological decision-making, which is also something that sits uncomfortably with some elements of the social constructivist position, where obviously the tendency is to blur the distinction between facts and values, and this appears to separate them out. I mean, just to say a little bit more about how those arguments are made. The argument that expertise is real essentially depends on recognizing the importance of tacit knowledge and the idea that tacit knowledge is acquired through socialization and that tacit knowledge is an important constituent part of expertise. And the argument is simply that if becoming an expert means acquiring tacit knowledge, then becoming an expert means being socialized into that community, and socialization either happens or it doesn't. You're either a member of that community, you've either interacted with those people, or you haven't. And if you haven't had the social interaction, then you can't gain the tacit knowledge, then you can't be an expert. And so in that sense, expertise is real, regardless of whether or not anybody else in the society grants the status of expertise to the people that possess that knowledge. So that's how we want to argue that expertise is, as real, can be distinguished from the social status of the label expert. In terms of distinguishing between the technical and political, then it kind of follows on from that argument, really. To the extent that you see expertise as being linked to the experiences that people have, the experiences that people have will differ. There will therefore be a distribution of expertise, with some people having more of one kind of expertise and less of another. And what we're saying is that when it comes to technological decision-making, you can distinguish between those aspects of the decision-making where you want people with specialist expertise to take part, and therefore only those with the relevant experience should be included, and those more broadly based political, democratic aspects of it, in which case having specialist expertise is not required and may even be a hindrance. And so by thinking about the distribution of expertise, you can also think about the distribution of, or the availability of, different kinds of participants for taking part in technological decision making. Okay, so just to sort of summarize that in the diagram that we put in the paper, the three waves refer to three different ways of thinking about the relationship between experts who might be scientists but who might not be, and lay people or citizens in technological decision making in the public domain, by which we're really talking about policy decisions that have some element of scientific or technical knowledge as a constituent part of what needs to be considered when making the decision. So, as you're looking at it, wave one on the left is something of a straw man, admittedly, but it's the characterization of and its role in policy making if you see science as being true, objective. It's kind of a post-World War II version of science policy making, where science provides authoritative knowledge which is pretty much non-negotiable, and in which the role of lay people, the wider citizenry, is kind of to accept this truth and deal with it, essentially. So in its more extreme forms, it would look like technocracy. In its milder forms, it looks a bit like technological determinism. But it's very much a case, it's a sort of social system in which scientists are the authoritative. They give knowledge, citizens receive knowledge. Okay. In a sense, it's that sort of the relationship between society that we see wave two, mainstream STS, as kind of reacting against and pushing back against when it's making its critique of science and arguing for the contingent cultural nature of scientific practice. In essence, by showing that there is no special epistemology going on when scientists are doing science, by showing that scientific knowledge is in some sense mundane and ordinary, even if a bit esoteric, it's eliminating that boundary between science and society, and in so doing, it's making it porous, it's making it possible for people who are not scientists to contribute their expertise. And there are all manner of case studies in this sort of tradition that show how people from outside the narrowly defined scientific community have relevant expertise and experience that could and should be brought to bear on these kinds of decision makings, because they are able to challenge and contextualize the knowledge claims that scientists are making. Brian Wynn's work, for one, is a classic example of this sort of work, but there's lots of it in science and technology studies. And when I said on the previous slide that we're starting from that position, I mean it. We are starting from that position. Where we differ, I guess, is that and this is what makes wave 3 different from wave 2, I suppose, is that we're arguing that there's a kind of, because there's a distribution of experiences and a distribution of expertises, you've got to be more careful than I think we have been in the past in attributing expertise to lay people. And so there's a sense in the middle diagram where the boundary is eliminated completely. We talk about democratizing science, and as it were, the qualities that made these original people, the sheep farmers of Brian Wynn or the treatment advocates of Steve Epstein, studies, things that make them special and different and able to contribute, kind of get lost in their mischaracterization as ordinary folk. They're not ordinary folk. They are people with particular experiences and specialist knowledge. So what we want to argue for, and this is where the technical and the political phase comes in, is the sort of the top left-hand quadrant there where we've got certified specialists and uncertified specialists. That's the bit where you can combine the specialist expertise of science with the experience-based expertise of patient groups or local residents or other kinds of citizen groups that have relevant complementary experiences, and they all belong to the realm of specialist expertises. And the bit to the right includes both scientists from other disciplines and all the other ordinary citizens who have no particular specialist expertise. They can't contribute as experts, but nevertheless they can contribute as citizens. And that's really the distinction that we're making. And in order to characterize the distinction between those two ways of going on, we're arguing that it's the norms and values of those two different processes that matter. So the technical phase is characterized by scientific norms, of which I'll say more later. The political phase is characterized by democratic norms, and again we'll say a little bit more about those later. But the point is that they're different, and it's the difference of values that differentiates them. So rather than there being a fact-value distinction going on here, it's really a kind of value-value distinction. There's scientific values on the one hand, contrasted with democratic values on the other. Okay, so now we can get on to the science, onto the democracy and populism bit. And as I say, this is now where I'm going to draw on some basic sociological ideas. So they have philosophical roots as well, to kind of characterize what we mean by democracy and populism in order to give some working definitions that we can then build on for the rest of the presentation. As you're mostly philosophers, I'm hoping you'll be relaxed with the idea that the argument is going to be theoretical rather than empirical. We're going to talk about these concepts primarily as ideal types. We'll illustrate them with examples, but it's really trying to abstract some general features that will apply across a whole variety of different cases, is the aim of what's going on. And for those of you that know Harry's work, it will come as no surprise that the kind of key concept, the philosophical foundation of it, is going to be Wittgenstein's idea of form of and the idea of meaningful action being the way in which meaning is use. Ideas and actions being two sides of the same coin. That's the kind of principle that we're working with here. And in what follows, we're going to try and apply this sociologically to understand the role of knowledge and practice in social groups. So, in terms of what is a social group, I mean, this is a photo from the World Cup that was here not so long ago. These are football fans. Football fans are a kind of social group, I'm going to argue. And what we're interested in is trying to understand what makes a social group a social group. And the idea is that the arguments and the principles that we're going to set forward should apply whether or not the social group is a social group of football fans, as in this case, a professional group like sociologists, a more diffuse group like English people, British people, Russian people. The idea is that what we're trying to do is identify some general features that apply regardless of which sort of group you're talking about. Two things, I suppose, that are worth mentioning before we get going in terms of how we think about a social group. One is that, for us, it's not necessarily the case that the members of a social group have to be self-consciously aware of being members of a social group. I know there are some social scientists in our department who say that it's not a social group if people don't know that they're a member of it. We want to say that it is possible to be a member of a social group without knowing it. And so, for example, the community of English language speakers is our example of this. If you speak the English language, then you are a member of that social group, even if you don't necessarily recognize it as being such, because the capacity to speak the English language depends on being socialized into that group, whether you're aware of it or not. And to be fair, most children are not aware of it, but nevertheless they speak the language. So that's one important distinction. And the other important distinction, I suppose, is that not everything can be a social group. There are some similarities between people that don't count as social groups. So people that wear brown shoes, for example, wouldn't be, I don't think, a social group, even if it's possible for dress codes to be part of the ways in which people signify their membership of other social groups. Simply being a person who wears brown shoes does not, as far as I know, make you a member of the social group brown shoe wearers. Okay. So, to put that more formally, what we're arguing really is that you can think of any social collectivity as having two distinct elements or faces, two ways in which you can think about what's going on. On the one hand, you've got what we've called here the organic face, and these are the things that are uniform across the social group, more or less. The practices, the conventions, the beliefs that bind the group together and make it a group. So there's a sense in which as you're socialized into a social group, you can't choose these things. These are the things that are given to you through being a member of that social group. So, for example, if you're a member of the social group football fans, it's kind of constitutive of that you like football and enjoy watching it and you think it's important and exciting and interesting and all those things. The enumerative face of the social group is, if you like, the variation around that core uniformity. So it's the kind of possibilities, choices, the differences that don't make a difference in order to be a member of the group. So these are the things that you can choose. Obviously, the nature and range of what may be chosen varies over time, but the point is that you can be a member of the social group and do these different things and still be a member. They don't put you beyond the pale. So if we think about how that then applies to social groups and democracy or democratic societies, the way in which we would characterize a democratic society, and this is where we're offering our definition now that perhaps differs in some ways from the more elaborate typologies you get in political science books. Our definition or of a democratic society, the ideas and practices that we draw out as being important and common to all of them are these ideas of citizens as free and equal before the law, the importance of checks and balances, role of free elections, and so on. So there are some kinds of things that even if they're operationalized differently within different forms of democracy, if they're not there, it's kind of hard to see how democracy is going on at all. So these are the kind of uniform, organic, constitutive parts of a democratic society. And then the enumerative elements of a democratic society, they are the range of views and preferences within that society that are recognized as being legitimate, appropriate, are encouraged, celebrated, tolerated, whatever. So, there's I suppose, in Rawlsian terms, the organic face is pretty clearly aligned with his principles of liberal democracy, citizens as free and equal before the law, and so on. The enumerative face more or less corresponds, I guess, to what Rawls would call the comprehensive doctrines or that kind of stuff. So what we're arguing is that we can see democratic societies as a kind of balancing act between these organic features which have to be there and which, if they change very slowly, and these more variable enumerative features which may change more quickly and which at any one point in time will be different across a range of different democratic societies. Okay. So just to spell that out in just a little bit more detail. So what we're saying in, to make it clear, is a democratic society, or a well-functioning democracy at least, has regular elections that are seen to be free and fair. Again, I mean, these are, in some sense, I recognize these are aspirational statements. With any well-functioning democracy, there will be questions about the extent to which any particular election has been as free and fair as it might possibly be, but nevertheless, the unquestioned aspiration is that the election should be as free and fair as possible, and any deviation from that is seen as a problem that needs to be fixed. Likewise, you'd have a government led by the parties who gain the largest number of elected representatives. Again, within different forms of democracy, there will be different routes to determining who that might be, and it may or may not be that the largest number of elected representatives corresponds to the largest number of votes. Not everything is a perfect PR system, but nevertheless, there will be a mechanism in place through which votes in the election are translated into some form of government, and the mechanism for doing that will be clear. So that's the kind of front stage element of democracy that people focus on a lot. But what we've also added to that is the idea that, again, a well-functioning democracy also has these other kinds of features. It has a legitimate role for opposition parties, the people that didn't gain just number of elected representatives, and they're an important part of a well-functioning democracy as well. They have important work to do in holding the government to account. Likewise, there may be different levels of government. It might be a federal system, you might have a multi-cameral system. Again, these are the things that vary across different democratic states, but within any democratic state, you'll have some version of this form of check and balance. Likewise, independent judiciary, again, arguments about how independent it is, but nevertheless, the principle that it should be independent is not for discussion. And likewise, a free press, again, you might argue how free is it really, but nevertheless, the idea would be that it ought to be free, and the criticism would be that it's not free enough, not that it's too free. So with those sort of ideas in mind, we can start to think about then why and how we might differentiate democracy from populism. And I think it's important to do this because certainly in reading the political science literature around democracy and populism, and particularly reading book reviews about the slew of books that come out recently about populism and democracy, one of the standard tropes in these book reviews is, I don't agree with this author because I don't like their definition of populism. I think populism is this, they define populism as that, and therefore, because we disagree at the start, I reject everything that they say thereafter. So, accepting that as a risk and knowing there's nothing I can do about it, what I'm going to say now is, this is our definition of what populism is. It's not the only one out there, but it's the one that we're working with. So, one of the ways in which people represent populism, and this is one of the ways I think we want to reject, is that populism is somehow different from democracy because it claims to represent the will of the people. And clearly, democracy does that as well. So that doesn't really do much work if you say that populism is populism because it's popular and represents what people want. Democratic society is supposed to make sense. So I don't think that works. Likewise, there's a sense in which some people would define populism purely in terms of its anti-establishment rhetoric. So it's critical of elites and vested interests. And I'm not sure that works either, because I think within democratic societies, you would expect there to be a legitimate role for people and parties that do just that. So simply being opposed to the status quo or to whoever happens to be the current elite is not necessarily populist, if in that sense it means you're not being democratic. I think both of those things are perfectly compatible with a well-functioning democracy. Where the two start to diverge, I think, are in the attitudes that they take to pluralism and the roles of checks and balances. So, as part of the norms of democracy, we're arguing, there must be some kind of commitment to pluralism. And so to go back to our earlier definitions, that's a commitment to recognizing the value of those various enumerative elements. The background culture, the comprehensive doctrines. There are lots of different ways of going on in a democratic society, and this is okay. This is a good thing. In contrast, populism tends to be much less tolerant of the variety displayed in these enumerative elements, and this comes through the idea then of seeing of populist leaders, in particular, tending to reduce the complexity of their nation state or of their electorate to the views of that group that happened to vote for them, and then twisting that, if you like, so that then comes to stand for everybody. And so then you're either with them or you're against them, and then the difference of views becomes a deviant position rather than a legitimate position, because you're no longer one of the people anymore. you are an enemy of the people. So this rhetoric of the will of the people, with the people seen as a kind of unified, homogeneous group whose views and desires are articulated by the elected leader, is a core part of populism that doesn't really cash out in democracy, because you have to represent and recognize the legitimacy of diversity in democracy. Likewise then, within democracy, although it's not necessarily beneficial for you as an individual, if you're understanding the importance of these institutions, you have to recognize the importance and the value of the systems of checks and balances, even when they kind of hinder you. In contrast, populism seems much less tolerant about this, because these are invariably then implementation of the will of the people. And so the populist response to checks and balances is to kind of subvert or remove them in order that you can enact the will of the people more efficiently and more authentically. And so it's at that point, really, the different understanding of pluralism and checks and balances, I think, where you can really start to see a difference between democracy and populism. And in terms of those organic and enumerative elements, it's to do with the extent to which the organic face of democracy, the commitment to pluralism, is actually enacted. And in terms of the enumerative elements, it's the way in which variety is seen as a problem rather than strength. Seen this way, I think you can also then see why democracy was unstable. There's always the potential for it, I think, in any democratic society, for it to turn into something more populist. Part of the function of the way democracy works is it gives great power to the majority. The idea is that the checks and balances stop them abusing it, but nevertheless they do have great power. And this is the risk, and arguably this is what is happening in some of the examples we looked at earlier, is that it's slipping towards populism because the majority is no longer respecting the minority. So in practice, choices that belong to the enumerative, things that people should be allowed to do legitimately, are treated as if they belong to the organic, so they become natural rather than simply a choice. And things that were previously legitimate become reclassified as deviant or treacherous because they thwart the now clearly articulated will of the people. And that's how democracy slips into populism and into more authoritarian kinds of regimes. I mean, just to give a quick example, this is how it cashed out in Britain. So Daily Mail is a tabloid newspaper on the right-wing end of the political spectrum. In terms of the vote to leave the European Union, Daily Mail was very keen that the referendum result should go with leaving the European Union, which it did. Not by much, 52% to 48%, but nevertheless, the Leave campaign did win. And this is a headline that refers to a decision that was referred to the High Court, and the decision was whether or not the UK government needed to have a vote in order to begin the process of leaving the European Union. It wasn't whether or not the referendum result should stand or fall. It was a kind of procedural question as to what was the appropriate legal way of doing that. And the judges decided that the government couldn't do it by executive action. It needed to have a vote in the House of Commons. And the Daily Mail, amongst many other people on the Leave side of the argument, represented that decision that a vote in the House of Commons was necessary as an attempt to thwart the will of the people by delaying Brexit and preventing the referendum from being enacted. So you have this is just an example of the kind of ways in which relatively ordinary decisions become recategorized as acts of treachery or deviance. Okay, so moving on to science. I want to take a similar kind of approach to try and distinguish some features of science that we can then use to articulate its role in society and see how and why we might want to defend science as an important institution, regardless of where we stand on the realist constructivist debate about its epistemology. And the way in which we make the argument is similar. It's based on distinction between the organic and the enumerative, and in particular it's focusing on those kinds of organic values that characterize, if you like, the ideology of science, what it is that scientists need to think they're doing in order to be doing science scientifically. again, it's a bit like democracy in the sense it doesn't really matter so much if they deviate from that, as long as the deviations from it are seen as aberrations and not something that can be openly celebrated and maximized. So one of the ways in which we do this is, and this is the argument of the Why Democracies Need Science book that was at the bottom of the slide that was shown earlier on, is to identify some of the norms of science. And so Miltonian norms are a core part of this. I think where we differ, I suppose, from the way in which they've been described in the past is that we would see them as a set of aspirations to which scientists ought to aspire rather than a description of what it is that they actually do. And to some extent, we argue, or at least should be shared with, the organic aspect of well-functioning democracy. So commitments to universalism and disinterestedness and honesty and so on seem to be a part of democracy as much as they're a part of science. Likewise, the essential tension in science manifests itself as how do you strike that balance between individual claims and the collective understanding. Likewise, in democracy, there's a tension between what rights you allow the individual and at what point you can curtail those rights for the benefit of the society overall. So there are some overlaps between the two. They're not completely isomorphic. There are some things in democracy that have no place in science, and vice versa. There are some things in science that aren't really relevant for democracy. So it's not that the two things are the same, but there is some common ground between the two of them. And what we're saying is that if we think about science in those terms, in terms of the values that it embodies, rather than the methods that it uses or the content of its knowledge, that gives us ways to think about why scientific knowledge might be preferable. So in the Why Democracies Need Science book, we simply make the argument that knowledge that is produced according to these norms is preferable in a moral sense to knowledge that's produced in other ways, and we kind of go through it in a sort of counterfactual way in terms of thinking about, well, would you prefer knowledge that was never tested? Is that preferable to knowledge that has been tested or not? Would you prefer knowledge that's promoted by people who have a clear interest in its outcome to knowledge that's developed by people who at least try to minimize the conflict of interest? Would you prefer knowledge that's produced by people who are open to criticism to knowledge that's preferred by people who refuse to engage with any form of criticism at all? And so this isn't really an epistemic argument as such. It's a kind of moral argument that it's just better to do things this way. So that's the argument of why democracies need science. In terms of how this relates to the populism and democracy and science thing, there are kind of two things that we're working on developing from that basic argument. One is that to the extent that we see that science and democracy have some shared values, to the extent that science then continues to uphold and embody these values, it has the potential to provide some kind of moral leadership in this domain. And if we think about the ways in which some of our elected leaders are behaving at the moment, this might become an increasingly important role for science, because it's not clear that the democratic institutions are upholding the values with quite the clarity that they're used to. So science potentially functions as a bulwark or a reservoir of these kinds of important values that matter for democratic society as much as they matter for science. And then the second bit we want to argue is that, and this is more the new bit, I suppose, is that we can also see science for this reason as part of the system of checks and balances. So we want to say that science fits into a democratic society in much the same way that a free press or an independent judiciary fits into democratic society. It's not there to rule, it's not there to take decisions, but it is there to make life a little bit difficult for the people that are elected. It's something that constrains maybe, or constrains, if not constrains their choices, but at least constrains the justifications that they're able to give for those choices. And in that sense, we shouldn't be any more worried about the fact that scientists are experts on science than we are worried about the fact that judges are experts on the law. It's kind of part and parcel of doing the role of being part of the ecosystem of checks and balances that scientists have this kind of expertise. Clearly, if you give too much weight to it, it becomes technocracy, and that's a bad thing. But also, if you don't give enough weight to it, it becomes populism, and that's a bad thing. So it's all about trying to find this sort of balance in the middle where science is recognized as being a preferable form of knowledge and seen as fitting into this system of checks and balances. And again, if you think about how populist leaders think about science, arguably they undermine science for exactly the same reason they undermine the judiciary and the media. The kinds of arguments that they make are very similar. Ironically, they're very similar to the kinds of arguments we often make in science and technology studies. They position science and technology, or science and expertise, as being no more than the representatives of some elite vested interest group, and for that reason opposed to the will of the people, and therefore something that should be discounted or ignored. In contrast, I think if you're trying to argue for the value of democracy, then you should find yourself defending science for the same reasons as you defend the judiciary or the press. Not because science is more true, so not an epistemic argument, but because it has an important role to play in this system of checks and balances. So I guess what this means in terms of how we might respond to the classic alternative facts rhetoric is that what we're saying, the consequence of this argument, is that to simply dismiss the alternative facts rhetoric as some kind of silly kind of something that's not very important is to miss the power of the claim that's being made. It's actually quite an important move that the populist government is making when it claims the right to assert alternative facts. What it's trying to do, in much the same way as it tries to diminish the credibility of the free press or reconstitute the judiciary in its own image, is it's trying to rebalance the hierarchy of knowledge, or hierarchy of expertise within the society in their favor. It's trying to reduce the status or the privilege of science in order to say that these claims deserve no special status at all. So it's part of a wider pattern of behavior. It's not a kind of idiosyncratic event. It's part of a sort of more systematic undermining of a system of checks and balances. And for that reason, we should be worried about it. And we should be saying no to this discourse of alternative facts. I mean, the examples are, they're not that important. The one on the bottom right is the most famous one. It's the crowd at President Trump's inauguration on the right, Obama's on the left, and Trump's claimed that his crowd was the biggest crowd ever in the history of inaugurations, when to most untrained eyes, it looks like there's more people in the left-hand photo. And that's where the idea of alternative facts comes from. As I say, there's a tendency to dismiss that as just being silly, but I think it hints at something more systematic and dangerous going on that we need to be concerned about. So what we're arguing, to bring this little section to a close, is that technological decision-making should take account of relevant technical expertise. That for the reasons I've outlined now, just briefly, that technical expertise, whether it's scientific or experience-based, that's gained in accordance with scientific values, is to be preferred over that which has not been gained that way. In terms of how that might filter out, and this, I guess, is where it differs from some of the more democratizing science stuff, is that if you see expertise as having a distribution, then it's not possible for everybody to be an expert about everything. So the people who are not the specialists need some knowledge about what the experts know, but they're never going to know as much as the experts. So there's still a role for some kind of mediating institution to communicate the content and strength of expert consensus, such as it is, to the wider population, such that they're able to exercise their democratic role in a kind of informed way. And then finally, just to reiterate this point, because we're often accused of being advocates of technocracy. We're not. What we're saying really is that technical advice, if it's seen as part of this system of checks and balances, does not determine the political decision, but what it does do is limit the ways in which it should be justified. I suppose just so to give a simple example, one of our PhD students, Martin Vinal, who's a co-author on the paper, his research was about the use of AZT to treat AIDS in South Africa when Thabo Mbeki was president. One of the ways in which Tabo Mbeki justified his decision not to use AZT was by claiming there was a scientific controversy at the time about the safety of the treatment. There was no meaningful scientific controversy at the time. Maybe 10, 15 years prior to that, there had been a controversy, but at the time he made the statement, the science was as settled as it was ever going to be. And so what we're saying is that Mbeki should not have justified his decision in that way. There are other ways he could have justified it, and that would have been fine. He could have said that he was worried about the cost of it. He could have said he was worried about being in hock to multinational pharmaceutical companies. He might have said that he was worried about perpetuating a myth of Africa as a disease-ridden country. There are all kinds of justifications that he could have given, and they would have been fine. The point is the one that he did give was inaccurate, and he shouldn't have given it. And that's really our point. So just to sort of wrap up then, in terms of where we're going in terms of a sort of more how we might see these ideas applied in practice. Harry, being a great fan of physics, as those of you who know his work will know, has coined a phrase that derives from physics. He's talked about the conservation of democracy. And the idea that he's trying to capture here is that you can only get as much democracy out of a system as you put into it. I would rephrase that as saying that, again, going back to the Wittgensteinian ideas that we started with, we need to think about democracy as a practice and not just a set of ideas. And so democratic aspirations need to be preserved as organic aspects of society. But in doing that, that can only happen if the citizens and members of those societies actually live the practice of doing democracy. So clearly it's important to vote, but voting is not enough. There's a whole series of other things that also need to happen if democratic societies or democratic values are to successfully reproduce themselves. And I'm not saying these are easy, I'm just saying these are the things that I think need to happen. So one of the things that needs to happen is you have to accept that checks and balances are necessary, even when they don't work for you. Recognize that scientific and technical expertise is part of these checks and balances. And what we're arguing then is that a public understanding of the process of science, if you like, part of and this is perhaps our role as scholars and analysts of science, part of our role is to contribute to this public understanding of science so that people are able to understand what science can do, what it can't do, and have a more realistic set of expectations around it. So, for example, we might want to argue that science should no longer be seen as a truth machine. I mean, speaking to some of my undergraduate students, I think they already think this. Perhaps they're kind of further off in that direction than I would like them to be. But certainly what seems to follow, I think, from STS is that there's no case for having a blind faith in science or treating it with unquestioned authority. So we can't go back that way. We can only go forward into a future in which we see that controversy is going to be the norm for science in most of the cases that matter to us as citizens. That said, I think we can also start to see, and this is where I think what I'm arguing kind of butts up against some of the other positions in mainstream STS, is even if we see that science is not impartial, it doesn't necessarily follow from that it's the unthinking stooge of political or other elites. And that's more the kind of dilemma we have to work our way through. Expertise can play an important role in challenging political decisions. And again, our role perhaps as professional analysts of science is to contribute to thinking through and advocating ways in which science and other forms of expertise might be used to hold political decisions to account, but also to inform them in a way that makes them a little bit better. I won't go through this in any detail. In the Why Democracies Need Science book, we have a suggestion for how this might be done. I've already kind of covered the main points of it. The idea is that you would need some committee of experts. The new innovation is that you would have sociologists and philosophers of science as part of that committee, that the outcome is really an indication of the strength and content of consensus, and that the idea is that this needs to be recognized by policymakers in terms of how they justify their decisions. So it's clear to citizens when policymakers are choosing, if they choose to either ignore a very strong consensus or take a big risk on the basis of something that's seen by the experts as radically uncertain. Other ways of doing it are possible, but I think general principles are important. Okay, so just to sum up the main points. What I've tried to say, I suppose, is that all groups have these two faces. There's the organic and the normative, and that applies from the very small scale to the very large scale. If we think in particular about science and democracy, we can see that the organic faces of both these forms of life share some values, but not all values. If we think about democracy as a practice, it includes this idea of checks and balances, and I'm arguing that scientific expertise, or expertise more generally, is part of this system of checks and balances, but only part of it, like the Goldilocks porridge. You can't have too much, you can't have too little, but it is nevertheless an important part of it. And then if we want to defend democracy, then we must do our best to live by those values. And part of that is knowing how and when to trust expertise. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your brilliant presentation. And since I expect many questions, I will be the first one, if you permit. Я поблагодарил господина Эванса за презентацию и попросил разрешения задать первый вопрос. Would you please get back to the picture number 7? Вперед. Yes.
Okay.
So my question is, are you speaking about the development of the discipline, namely science studies, or you are rather speaking about the stages in the development of the interrelation between science and society? Would you please clarify?
The former of those two options, the idea of the three waves is a heuristic device for categorizing developments in particularly sociology of science, perhaps to a lesser extent philosophy of science. Philosophy of science where it's impacted and been aligned with sociology of science, but it's primarily a potted history of science studies in a way that tries to emphasize the differences between schools of thought and tries to explain how one builds on and challenges the other and then moves into the next stage. So it's not, strictly speaking, a description of how science and society interact, because if you were to do that, then you would probably say that something like wave one, which is very marginal in terms of science and technology studies, is still pretty powerful in most practical senses. And so where it might have been replaced or superseded to a large extent in the academic discipline of science studies, wave one is probably still quite normal in the sort of policy making or the interactions between science and society sort of out there in the real world. Does that answer the question?
Okay. Thank you very much. Коллеги, поднимите, пожалуйста, руки, кто хочет задать вопрос. Would you please raise the hand if you like to ask a question? Okay. And please come to me. Выходите сюда, потому что без микрофона вы не зададите вопрос. You will be the next one.
Well, thanks for lecture. I wonder, what's public understanding of science project for you? I mean, science fairs is not understanding of science. I mean, it was one of the points of the last of your slides. I mean, you said something about the need of public and more need of public understanding of science.
Yes. Okay. So I did end up glossing over that quite a bit. So thank you for the opportunity to say a little bit more about it. I mean, I guess, as you know, there are a range of different approaches to public understanding of science, which to some extent you can map onto these diagrams as well. So by public understanding of science, I'm not explicitly arguing for an increase in what you might call scientific literacy. I mean, I think it's good that people know science, but I don't think that's going to solve the problems, precisely because lots of the things that we're going to be concerned about in policy making are going to be controversial science, and in that sense, what the facts of the matter are precisely what's up for dispute. So in that sense, knowing more science might be useful, but it's probably not going to help. I'm not especially arguing for upstream engagement activities either in terms of the framing problem, though I recognize that's important, and I think that's something that could be promoted, and I wouldn't want to see any less of that, and indeed there could be more of that. But again, that tends to be, and it's important, but that's primarily happening before the controversy has hit the public domain. So I think we can think about different kinds of engagement, public engagement with science and technology, and that should carry on. I suppose what we're talking about often in these contexts, though, is more kind of downstream mediation of science, because the controversy is kind of out there. And there, I suppose, I'm aligning myself more with what you might think of as the public understanding of the process of science. That sort of comes as no surprise, co-authoring with Harry the Golan books and so on. And I think the idea there is that what we would hope is that, and I say this is why I think it's part of our professional role and responsibility, because if we don't do this, I don't know who will, is to try and articulate and broadcast a more, as I would see it, realistic understanding of what science can and cannot do, so that when people are confronted with these controversies, they have a better understanding, not necessarily of the niche content of them, but of the broader process of science and scientific work and scientific practice that necessarily lies behind it. And so then we'll be in a better position to take decisions about, or take a view about, how to respond to these situations of essentially uncertainty. So does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Thanks. Oh, okay. I'll just stand here. Okay. I won't be aggressive. No. The first thing I want to say is, just first of all, that democracy and populism, if you were going back to ancient Greece, they would be seen as the same thing and be seen as negative. Okay? And so it seems to me that what we're doing now is operating with a different notion of democracy when we want to counterpose it to populism, right? It's a different notion of democracy, and it's one that presupposes representative democracy. In other words, the people don't necessarily speak for themselves, right? And if you want to actually do the best for the people's interest, you don't necessarily let the people speak for themselves. You let someone else speak on their behalf, and this is why we have had elected legislatures and things of that kind, parliaments, things of that kind for all time. I understand. Science. Why isn't science part of this, right? So in other words, if in fact science is the sort of thing that is speaking on behalf of the public interest, why can't it be elected by the people the way in which other sorts of elected legislatures are, right? I mean, in other words, if you believe in democracy in the modern sense, which is not populist, then you're obviously allowing other people to speak on your behalf, and they're elected. And so why shouldn't scientists equally be elected, just as the other people are who speak on your behalf? Is that clear?
Okay, thank you.
I guess the short answer to that, because I know you want, is that one of the distinctions, or one of the normative differences between scientific institutions and democratic institutions is that scientific institutions operate on a principle of something much closer to meritocracy in terms of...
So why can't people decide who they are, who the meritocratic people are? By definition, right?
No, I don't think so. Because you want to be able to say that, in principle, all views are equal within a democracy, and the purpose of the aggregation is to choose between them, and then...
So why can't people decide who's meritorious?
Do you want us to keep going on with this? The point would be that when a scientist speaks for the scientific community, they do so from a position that they've gained I think it's to do with the underpinning normative values of the two disciplines, and what makes science scientific and democracy democratic is precisely the difference that you've alluded to, that you don't elect scientists.
Еще один вопрос. Last question. No? Thank you very much. Спасибо большое. Because it's my turn now.
Okay.
This is microphone. And this is...
Okay. See, okay. I'm going to sit there. Okay. I'm going to go and sit there so I can see your slides.
Okay, but take the microphone first and give the floor to me. I cannot take it myself.
Oh, sorry. Okay. A piece of conference etiquette that I found. I now formally have to pass to Professor Kasavin, who will give his keynote talk. Thank you. Is that okay?
Thank you very much. Уважаемые коллеги, я начну с того, что представлю вам три мотивации, почему я заинтересовался этой темой и решил на эту тему поговорить. Во-первых, это 200-летие со дня рождения Карла Маркса, которое отмечается в этом году, и которое мы решили отметить. It's a short introduction, not very important. И которое мы решили отметить в нашем журнале «Эпистемология, философия, науки» тем, что опубликовать тематический номер. Да, и вот в рамках этого тематического номера Сергей Николаевич Корсаков... Да что ж такое? Так слышно? Да, Сергей Николаевич Корсаков предложил опубликовать ранее неизвестный текст Бориса Гессена, а именно его выступление перед Ком-академией по итогам его визита на Конгресс по истории и науке в Лондоне в 1931 году. Как вы знаете, это было знаковое событие. И в этом своем докладе он кое-что прояснил. Интересное, в частности, то, что касалось его понимания марксизма в Англии, специфического типа вот этого марксизма, достаточно критического его к нему отношения, хотя вообще-то английские марксисты его там поддерживали и так далее. И последний момент связан с тем, что вот идеи Гессена, в том числе в этом докладе, но опять, да, и в докладе, и в его первоначальном докладе на Конгрессе оказались созвучны современным дискуссиям, которые ведутся по поводу так называемых зон обмена, trading zones. И вот соавтор Гарри Коллинза, как раз один из тех людей, которые активно участвуют в обсуждении этой темы, выяснилось, что идеи Гессена могут быть плодотворно использованы для критики этой концепции, но критики не негативной, а наоборот улучшающей. Можно попытаться развить эту концепцию с помощью этих идей. Ну, прошу прощения, значит, обо мне тоже несколько слов. Да, мой доклад называется «Критика Борисом Гессеном. Рыночные метафоры для исследований науки». Презентация будет на английском, говорить я буду по-русски. Ну, таким образом, в общем, это будет понятно. Вот основная линия аргументации, которую я вам представлю. Я полагаю,
что рыночная метафора в исследованиях науки сегодня, ну и ранее, представляет собой вид экономического детерминизма. Хотя этот подход отчасти и может быть использован для понимания того, что такое прикладные науки, прикладные исследования, он ведет к фатальному недопониманию того, что представляет собой исследование фундаментального типа. Второй тезис. Борис Гессен был, на мой взгляд, тем самым первым человеком, который понял философские следствия из рыночной метафоры для понимания науки, и понял это именно исходя из марксового тезиса по поводу товарного фетишизма и его критики. И, наконец, третье, об этом я уже частично сказал, для того, чтобы правильно понять идеи самого Гессена, нам нужно посмотреть на них именно вот с этой стороны, как они помогают раскрыть природу вот этой рыночной метафоры для понимания науки, и как они помогают переосмыслить понятие зоны обмена, выдвинутое вот Питером Галлисоном и Гарри Коллинзом, и как можно это понятие пересмотреть. Пересмотреть, ну, на мой взгляд, довольно неожиданным образом, хотя об этом кое-кто уже писал, пересмотреть в понятиях не рыночного обмена, а обмена дарами, об этом писал Марсель Мосс, и в контексте также понятия науки как общественного блага, которое выдвинул Мишель Коллон. Для того, чтобы глубже понять, что представляет собой фигура Гессена и его идеи, я воспользуюсь, который предложил Имре Лакатос в 1968 году в своей работе «Criticism and the Methodology of Scientific Research Programs». Он там различил три такие воображаемые персонажа: Поппер 0, Поппер 1 и Поппер 2. So, I'm referring to this work of Imre Lakatos in order to make difference between Popper 0, Popper 1 and Popper 2, and to use it in order to understand the ideas of Boris Gessen. Так вот, этот подход можно применить к пониманию Бориса Гессена и выделить Гессен 0, Гессен 1 и Гессен 2. Кто такой Гессен 0? Ну, для этого надо вспомнить, кто такой Поппер 0, да, отчасти. Я напомню, значит, это карикатурная фигура Поппера, по мнению Лакатоса, которая подвергается атакам со стороны представителей венского кружка, например, Альфреда Айера или Эйера, и которая, по сути, так сказать, представляет собой полное непонимание того, что говорит Поппер. Он называется ими наивным фальсификационистом, то есть человеком, который полагает, что если есть эмпирическое свидетельство, опровергающее теорию, то ее реально ученые и отбрасывают. Но этого, конечно, не происходит, и Поппер так не думает. Так вот, по мнению Лакатоса, а что же здесь мы имеем, если мы выдвигаем понятие Гессен 0? Гессен 0 – это человек, который на конгрессе лондонском был подвергнут критике с точки зрения идеалистического понимания истории науки. Истории науки как филиации идей. И эти критики заклеймили его как экономического детерминиста, потому что в науке, вообще говоря, ничего кроме идей нету, и рассматривать взаимоотношения науки с техникой, науки с обществом нет никакого смысла. Наука – это особая башня из слоновой кости, где, значит, так сказать, главенствует разум, и вот эволюцию этого разума и надо прослеживать. Но здесь ситуация еще более сложная на проверку. Дело-то в том, что критиковали они не самого Гессена, как выясняется, а тех людей, которых они знали лучше, чем Гессена. Например, Джозефа Нидема. И основания для этого определенные были. В действительности, давайте посмотрим на вот этот знаменитый тезис, который называется тезисом Джозефа Нидема. По-английски он звучит именно так, а по-русски несколько иначе. Значит, почему же, собственно, вот эта современная наука, то есть наука нового времени, которая представляла собой математическую гипотезу по поводу природы со всеми своими следствиями для развитой техники, подобно метеору на небосводе возникла на Западе во время Галилея, но не развивалась в рамках китайской цивилизации. И, как мне представляется, при всем уважении к Джозефу Нидему, замечательному китаисту, ученому и так далее, надо понимать, что он задает вопрос такого, я бы сказал, метафизико-онтологического свойства, не задаваясь, по сути, сомнением, что была какая-то наука нового времени, это, что называется, очевидно, что была какая-то математика по поводу какой-то определенной совершенно природы, и можно сопоставлять технику, которая развивалась в Китае и в Европе некоторыми объективными способами. Короче говоря, что вот это утверждение имеет само по себе характер некоторой онтологической гипотезы. Так вот, Гессен с этим не согласился бы. И поэтому к пониманию Гессена скорее применима другая квалификация. Гессен один. Это, мы бы его назвали не метафизическим реалистом, а утонченным экстерналистом, который ставит эпистемологические вопросы. Он ставит вопросы, в которых акцентирован метод понимания некоторой реальности науки и общества. То есть он задает вопрос, а как можно реконструировать? Как можно реконструировать ньютоновскую механику? Какими способами? И в названии его доклада это есть. То есть социально-экономические корни. Вот это мой способ реконструкции. Что такое ньютоновская механика сама по себе? Там этого нет. Это просто одна из точек зрения. Так вот, я полагаю, что именно здесь он исходил, и, кстати, в докладе это есть, здесь он исходил из критики вот этой самоочевидной онтологии, как некоторого рода товарного фетишизма, который он отграничивал от другого понимания науки, эпистемологического понимания науки и деятельностного понимания науки. И, наконец, еще один аспект, который важен для понимания идеи Гессена и его подхода. Назовем его Гессен-2, а именно социальный конструктивист. Он ясно и отчетливо пишет по поводу того, что практическая реконструкция, так сказать, развитие, реконструкция — это английский термин, здесь и подходит, развитие, управление наукой и является основанием для того, чтобы ее исторически реконструировать. Для того, чтобы нам реконструировать что-то как историкам, нам надо быть включенным в политическое преобразование. Тогда это будет более-менее объективно. И поэтому история науки основана на политической философии науки. Я напомню, что Фейерабенд, иронически отзываясь на вот эту тройную классификацию Локатоса, сказал, что сам Локатос, вероятно, это Поппер 3. потому что реальный поппер по локатусу – это комбинация поппера 1 и поппер 2. А сам локатус, поскольку он находится как бы извне этой классификации, он должен занимать более высокую позицию, и на деле локатус является вообще не сторонником методологии научно-исследовательских программ, а он скрытый анархист и социолог науки. Особенно учитывая его венгерское прошлое, там, его диссертацию и так далее. Вот это, говорит, настоящий локатус, скорее всего. Ну, об этом немножко позже. Но вот эту идею о том, что существует поппер 3 и Гессен 3 тоже существует, я вам рекомендую запомнить. Вот это несколько фраз, которые подтверждают то, что я сказал по поводу идеи Гессена. Это фраза самого Гессена, цитаты. Да? Великое историческое значение метода, созданного Марксом, состоит в том факте, что знание не рассматривается как пассивное, созерцательное восприятие реальности, но как средство ее активной реконструкции. Но извините, я вынужден русский текст, переведенный на английский, переводить теперь опять на русский. Да, второй тезис. Практику не следует объяснять с помощью идей, но напротив, идеологические структуры должны быть объяснены при помощи материальной практики. Третий тезис. Фетишизм товарной системы, которую Маркс так замечательно раскрыл, состоит в факте, что отношения материальных вещей, созданных человеческим обществом, изолируются от человеческих отношений и рассматриваются как внутренне присущие вещам самим по себе. И, наконец, последнее. Этот фетишизм может быть расшифрован и раскрыт пониманием того, что это вовсе не вещи, которые создают отношения, но что отношения между вещами, созданными в процессе социального производства, попросту выражают особенные социальные отношения между людьми, которые они постигают в фантастической форме отношений между вещами. Давайте попробуем теперь как бы реконструировать эту идею рыночной метафоры, последовательно ее проследить. На эту тему вообще много написано. Есть такой замечательный исследователь, например, Филипп Мировский. Он, если я не ошибаюсь, в 2010 году опубликовал книгу, которая называется «Science Mart». Ну, Mart – это сокращенный от Market. Значит, и где он, конечно, подвергает критике вот эту идею. Ну, мне бы хотелось вот как-то более последовательно, может быть, так наивно прописать, а что же такое вот эта рыночная метафора для понимания науки и познания. Что такое научное знание с этой точки зрения? Это просто товары. Какова цель? Какова цель продуцирования, производства знания? Да? Какова цель производства знания? Это продажи. Какова высшая форма знания? Это технология. Каковы критерии эффективности производства знаний? Но это минимизация расходов и максимизация прибыли. А цена знания детерминирована балансом спроса и предложения. Когнитивный капитал – это совокупность знания, которая способна притягивать инвестиции. Наконец, что такое научное образование? Это стартап. Что такое популяризация знания? Это рента. И что такое СТС, как способ исследования знания? Это что-то вроде когнитивного дериватива. по аналогии с финансовыми деривативами, то есть это какой-то, сказать, на теле реальной экономики. И в этой связи мне представляется, что рыночная метафора задумана как некоторое универсальное объяснение прикладной науки в качестве нормальной науки по Куну, той самой науки, которой ученые занимаются, должны заниматься в основном, а все остальные формы науки — это что-то вот девиантное, революционное и так далее и тому подобное. Так вот, критикуя эту рыночную метафору, я хотел бы высказать 3 тезиса. На мой взгляд, идеологическая рамка, идеологический фундамент рыночной метафоры — это и есть тот самый товарный фетишизм. С точки зрения истории науки, историко-научный эквивалент рыночной метафоры — это, конечно же, вульгарный экстернализм, в котором и обвиняли Бориса Гессена. Парадоксальным образом, понимаете? И здесь надо понять, что не он был сторонником рыночной метафоры, а наоборот, он был ее критиком. И, наконец, философский эквивалент рыночной метафоры — это метафизический реализм, который за вещами, за реальностью, за онтологией не видит людей, видит их отношения, не видит их отношений в обществе между собой. Да, так вот, я считаю, что рыночная метафора принципиальным образом ограничена и понимание технологических революций, и для понимания того, как в обществе знание взаимодействует с людьми, с социальными группами, с общественными отношениями и так далее. Еще раз, мы увидим чуть-чуть ниже, что гессеновская критика, на которой я основываюсь, может вести к полному пониманию того, что такое зона обмена в науке. Вот здесь перед вами замечательные люди, которых узнать нетрудно. Альфред Норт Уайтхед, Бруно Латур, Питер Галлисон. Ну, я должен сказать, что здесь я пытаюсь ответить Уайтхеду и Латуру, ну, частично опираясь на Галлисона, хотя вообще ему тоже есть кое-что мне сказать. Так вот, на идею Уайтхеда, подход Уайтхеда, замечательного мыслителя и, в общем, одного из любимого мною, и мы немало сделали, чтобы опубликовать его труды в 90-м году, идеи Уайтхеда, конечно же, представляют собой вариант идеалистической, уж извините меня за такое слово, идеалистической истории науки. Потому что в своих трудах он много пишет о социальном контексте развития науки, упоминает самые разные вещи, но периодически замечает, ну это все никакой роли не играет. Это все никакой роли не играет. А главное, это тихое приключение мысли, которое лежит в основе всех, так сказать, технологических революционных сдвигов. Да, так вот, именно такого рода подход и лежал в основе той критики, которая обрушилась на Гессена со стороны из английских историков науки. Они именно так науку себе представляли. Но мы же с вами сейчас как-то по-другому уже мыслим, наверное, постепенно приходим к идее о том, что специфические черты знания, в общем-то, не вытекают из свойств самого разума. Они скорее вытекают из чего-то, что находится за пределами головы. То есть знание можно понять наиболее адекватно, если представить его как часть культуры, и как результат развития культуры. Вот это противоречит позиции Вайтхеда. Сегодня, в наши дни, есть люди, которые защищают, на мой взгляд, странную наивную позицию онтологизма, провозглашая даже онтологический поворот, ontological turn, I'm speaking about now, и которые полагают, что вот такие фразы, things strike back, например, вещи дают сдачи, да, сами по себе это вещи, свалившиеся с неба, я так понимаю, никем не сделанные, да, или что можно оправдать позицию, которая Полом Богосяном называется fact objectivism, то есть вот жесткие такие, знаете, непоколебимые факты служат основанием для того, чтобы либо одну теорию доказать, либо другую теорию опровергнуть и так далее. Мне кажется, что такого рода метафизический реализм, который, вообще говоря, смыкается с метафизическим идеализмом, требует критики. Критики с точки зрения коммуникативной картины научного знания, которую попытался представить Питер Галлисон, когда сформулировал свою идею зоны обмена. И именно такой вот коммуникативный способ представления науки, по-видимому, наиболее плодотворен и для понимания всей истории научной мысли и практики. Ну, перед вами два других замечательных человека, это Марсель Мосс и Мишель Коллон. Я уже много раз повторяю, критика товарного позволяет усовершенствовать идею зоны обмена. А как же, да? Ну вот давайте вспомним, как Питер Галлисон к этой идее приходит. О чем он в первую очередь вспоминает, какую он аналогию проводит. Это некая первобытная торговля, где эквивалентом служат раковины каури. Они и сейчас на Коста-Бланка, можно их набрать сколько хотите. Бесплатно. Да. Так, это торговля, где идет обмен. Почему-то именно эта аналогия, эта метафора ему в голову для понимания того, что такое наука. Это экономическая метафора, это рыночная метафора. Иное дело, что потом он, конечно, об этом как-то старается забыть и переходит в другие, так сказать, уже измерения научного взаимодействия. Но первоначальным толчком может как раз вот эта рыночная метафора. Это рыночная метафора. Давайте посмотрим. Смотрите, в рыночной экономике существует довольно жесткое различие между объектами и личностями в зависимости от понятия, так сказать, собственности. На рынке и на товары полностью переходит к покупателю. Объект, если хотите, отчужден от своего производителя, производитель может его забыть. Теперь им покупатель. Ну, как нам применить к науке? Это довольно трудно, понимаете? Если у меня есть знание, и я даже его продал, оно же никуда от меня не делось. Даже если у меня есть когда знание запатентованное, и я продал этот патент, ну хорошо, я заработал деньги, а куда-то знание у меня делось? Нет, оно никуда не делось, оно осталось. Я могу еще раз продать его. Я могу его много раз продать. Оно одно, а я его много раз продаю. Как-то это не получается. Оно от меня никак не отчуждается, понимаете? А что происходит в другой экономике? И, кстати говоря, если мы говорим о первобытном обществе, то неплохо обратиться к настоящим антропологам.
одним из которых был как раз Марсель Мосс. Он видел, что в древней экономике есть не столько вот привычная нам рыночная система обмена, товар эквивалентом, товар и так далее, а там есть нечто другое, и он назвал это экономикой дара. Что это такое? Объекты, которые передаются другому, как бы собственнику в кавычках, не отчуждаются от первоначального собственника. Они скорее передаются во владение, передаются, ну, если хотите, в долг, да, в заем, скорее значительно в большей степени, чем просто продаются и отчуждаются. Поскольку дары в этой экономике не отчуждаемы от дарителя, они должны быть возвращены. И потому факт дарения позволяет людям образовывать особые отношения, неразрывные, взаимные, взаимных обязательств. Ну, давайте вспомним, каковы отношения между учителем и учеником. Не похожи ли они на это? Вот в науке, да, когда учитель учит, ученик воспринимает, а учитель вообще-то ожидает, что этот ученик будет его идеи развивать, ну, говоря современным языком, может быть, даже будет на него ссылаться иногда, да, будет его идеи пропагандировать каким-то образом, рассказывать о них, ну, по крайней мере, их усвоит, а сам учитель, между прочим, от этих идей не откажется при этом. Ну, вот научная школа, по идее, и должна быть так устроена. Это экономика дара. Да, ну, мы понимаем, что аргумент Марселя Мосса был направлен на то, чтобы обосновать идею своего учителя. Кстати, это как хороший пример. Своего учителя Дюркгейма, который развивал концепцию солидарности. Вот откуда берется эта концепция солидарности. Люди обмениваются дарами. И они вступают в такие отношения, которые не разрывают их. Не просто так, мы встретились на рынке, я тебе отдал, ты получил, мы расстались и больше никогда не увидимся. А, кстати, на рынке даже такого и не бывает. Если это хороший продавец, хороший товар, он опять придет. Даже там возникают какие-то отношения другого рода, не чисто рыночные, которые служат, кстати, развитию рынка. И об этом можно... И то, что мы хотим применить для понимания фундаментальных исследований, фундаментальной науки, является не зонами обмена вот в таком рыночном смысле, а скорее зонами дарения. И в таком случае эти зоны могут быть использованы для того, чтобы наука функционировала в обществе не как коммерческое предприятие, а как что-то вроде общественного блага, которое одаряет всех своим светом, своим разумом, своими демократическими традициями, о которых как раз говорил Роберт Эванс, и которая, ну, тем самым способствует общественному прогрессу. И тогда наука имеет шанс заслужить особое общественное уважение, особый общественный статус. Об этом я скажу в конце. А пока, на мой взгляд, Борис Гессен может быть рассмотрен именно как основатель такого интегративного подхода, который я бы назвал социальной философией науки. В основании этого подхода лежит критика метафизического реализма как философской позиции и противопоставление ему другой позиции, согласно которой приоритетом обладает эпистемология. Онтология сама должна быть объяснена с точки зрения эпистемологии. А конструктивизм, конструкция обладает приоритетом презентаций, потому что эпистемологу и философу науки надо объяснить, откуда берется эта репрезентация, как она конструируется. А если просто сказать «вот она», то мы опять попадаем в плен вот этого самого метафизического реализма. Специфический статус науки, который она, к сожалению, теряет в современном обществе, может быть отчасти реабилитирован, воскрешен, но несколько иным способом. Не тем, чтобы дистанцировать науку от всего другого общественного целого, возгрузить ее на какую-то вершину, на пьедестал и сказать, что вот наука — это что-то совершенно особенное. Напротив, надо показать, что наука способна к общественному взаимодействию и способна улучшать наше общество, способна его совершенствовать благодаря тому, что сама наука себя правильно осознает себя не по аналогии с теми специфическими, частными, общественными, экономическими трендами, которые вообще всегда были и всегда будут, коммерциализация и так далее, да? Но чтобы она осознала себя именно как общественное благо. И в первую очередь это задача фундаментальной, конечно, науки, потому что прикладная наука в этом особенно не нуждается. А именно фундаментальная наука, которая основана на вот этой самой научной солидарности в рамках зон дарения, на мой взгляд, и может быть таким образом понята. Спасибо за внимание. Ну, у нас есть несколько минут на вопросы. Пожалуйста, подходите, берите микрофон.
Мне кажется, метафора рыночной экономики или рынка, прошу прощения, крайне плодотворна, но не в том ракурсе, который имел место в других, а скорее вот в другом ракурсе, о котором вы говорили. Важен аспект обмена, но не дарами, как это было в первобытном, а именно товарами. Потому что посмотрите, что сейчас эпистемологически составляет основную проблему, значит, методологии экономики. Проблема рационального выбора. И, значит, это обсуждается, ограниченность вот этого образа экономического человека, значит, который рационально решает всюду и всегда, значит, проблему обмена. И все Нобелевские премии по экономике, которые сейчас даются по поведенческой экономике, которая как раз и основана на критике, значит, вот этой модели рационального выбора. Но ведь совершенно очевидно, как мне, во всяком случае, представляется, что эпистемологически в науке основной проблемой становится проблема именно рационального выбора. И так, наверное, Поппера и надо понимать, всю эту попперовскую традицию. У него она основную роль играет. Мне вот так представляется. Как вы к этому относитесь?
Спасибо большое за ваш комментарий. Никакого особого вопроса здесь не увидел. Ну, понятно, что проблема рационального выбора никуда не делась. Но, понимаете, давайте тогда вернемся к вопросу о том, а что такое рациональность. И если вы рациональность понимаете как что-то самоочевидное, то вы опять попадаете в ту самую ловушку, о которой я говорил. Сама рациональность – это что? Основа обмена? Основа выбора? Ну, а как эта рациональность сформировалась в основе выбора? И так далее. Понимаете? Ну да, эксперимент. Так вот, давайте поговорим о более глубоких вещах, которые формируют эту научную рациональность, а не о том, что рациональность является основой выбора. Понимаете? Ну, конечно, в некотором смысле рациональность является основой выбора. Замечательно. Но что такое рациональность? Ответа на этот вопрос же нет. А вот это самый главный вопрос. Что такое рациональность науки? И вот я и пытаюсь это понять. Как формируется эта рациональность? Для Марселя Мосса, понятого, так сказать, сквозь призму Science Studies, это научная солидарность. Вот она и создает фундамент. И это исторически формирует. Там много выборов, понимаете? Но мы их не можем даже проконтролировать. Они ежечасно, ежесекундно совершаются учеными. Понимаете? И здесь речь не о том, чтобы построить логику выбора, а скорее адекватную историю этого выбора. Спасибо. You're welcome.
I will be brief because I only went on the basis of what was put in English. But I think the distinction between a gift zone and a trading zone is really the important issue as far as I can tell from this talk. And the idea here is if you're offering a gift, right, that is something that's free, and whether it continues to be reciprocated has to do with the recipient of the gift, right? So in other words, there's a social constructivist element in there that isn't necessarily in there with regard to trading zones. So if we're talking about science as offering a gift, the idea is the other person will see how good it is and then will want to reproduce it independently of any, metaphysical realism kind of thing going on. Because the notion of trading zone typically assumes that the scientist somehow has to prove that they've got something to give to a need that already exists in society. But if what you start from is the position of giving freely, then the other person sees how valuable you are in yourself. And I take it that's the value of talking about the gift-giving notion with regard to justifying science that doesn't necessarily have to be based on kind of metaphysical realism. I don't know if that's what you were going after, but I think that there's a strong difference there between the gift idea and the trading idea, insofar as the scientist offers freely and then the recipient sees, yes, we need this, right? And then they start to talk in the scientist terms.
Thank you very much for your comments, Steve. Another distinction is also very important. Not only the distinction between the trading zones and gift zones. This is a distinction between the fundamental research and applied research. And my idea was that trading zones, in some more economic sense, are applicable in principle for the understanding of the applied science, not completely perhaps, but at least partly, but hardly applicable to the understanding of basic research. Another social relations rule basic research. This was my idea. And I understand that Peter Gellison was far from believing in economical determinism and so forth. But the idea, how it sounds, trading zones, right? It's trade. In Russian, it's different. Russian translation hides the essence of this trade. It's zones of exchange. You know, this is Russian translation. It's quite different. So I'd like to underline another difference, which is crucial, I think. And the first distinction may contribute to justifying the second distinction. Thank you very much. Большое спасибо всем комментаторам и задававшим вопросы. Теперь у нас пленарный доклад. У нас не может быть, к сожалению, перерыва на кофе-брейк, потому что мы иначе ничего не успеем, но мы немножко раньше пойдем на обед. Поэтому я призываю проявить терпение и уважение к нашему пленарному докладчику, приехавшему из штата Индиана. Это далеко. Elizabeth Lloyd, please, you're welcome. Do you have a stick memory? Yes. Yes? Will you please? Misunderstood what I am saying.
No, it's got to be on this one. Run down and get those other. Teddy is going down to get the other stick memory from my case. Yeah, try the other way around. Yeah, I see it right there. There it is. Yeah. Or your facts. A fact is something known to be true. And all sides in this debate assume this fact, climate change. It may seem logical, therefore, to conclude that if climate change if climate has changed, then at least some of the recent extreme weather events like storms, floods, fires, and hurricanes are at least in part by climate change. But science know, however, that the situation is more complex because there have always been extreme events. So as our climate changes, there will be extreme events that would have happened without anthropogenic or man-made forcing. And by that, I mean without the, quote, aggregate effect of anthropogenic greenhouse gases and aerosols on the radiative balance. And for short, I'm just going to say without greenhouse warming. Within climate science, the field of detection and attribution, or DNA, that's D and A, not DNA, concerns the detection of anthropogenic effects on climate. The attribution part concerns how much or how severe these effects are, that is, how many degrees of temperature or how much precipitation or wind or hurricane force is due to the increase in the presence of greenhouse effect, which is what climate scientists call the causal forces on the climate system. And DNA is usually done pertaining to either long-term effects, and I won't be talking about that today, or to short-term extreme events, which is our topic. In other words, to what extent is a given extreme event or pattern of extreme events attributable to the increase in greenhouse gases? Now, clearly, this is a driving question of the day, especially as it relates to local droughts, floods, and storms, including the massive hurricane descending on the United States today. And there was already an attribution study done on this massive hurricane, attributing 50% of the additional precipitation of that storm to climate change. The methods used to attribute extreme events were first developed in 2003 and 2004 in England by climate scientists at Oxford and the Met Office, specifically Peter Stott, scientific head of climate monitoring and attribution at UK's Hadley Centre in Exeter, part of the Met Office, and Miles Allen and Freddie Otto and their colleagues at Oxford at the Environmental Change Institute. I just recently found out that this is funded by Exxon or Mobil, one of the two. They developed the probabilistic technique for attributing climate change to extreme events. Now, I took a trip to England in May of last year to talk with them about these matters and found especially Peter Stott to be very congenial. And here they are. That's Peter Stott in the middle, Frederica Otto on the left, and Miles Allen on the right. Stott is the most open-minded in this group, to my knowledge. They developed the now conventional technique for attributing climate change to extreme events. It involves examining the event as one in a class of events and using climate models to compare the probability of the event under current factual conditions, which they call P1, to its probability under counterfactual conditions, represented as P0, in which, contrary to fact, the climate did not undergo greenhouse warming and anthropogenic changes in general. The relevant probabilities are arrived at through studying climate models as well as empirical data. So they use climate modeling, they use empirical data to get these results. And in this risk-based analysis, the relevant probabilities are arrived at through studying climate models and data. The relevant diagnostics are the FAR and the risk ratio. We can clarify this approach as asking a specific research question. What is the probability of a specific class of weather event given our world with global climate change relative to a world without global climate change? For the rest of the talk, I'm going to refer to this as the risk-based or the probabilistic approach. Now, Sophie Lewis and David Caroli in 2013, for example, used the risk-based approach to conclude, that the risk of a record hot Australian summer, such as occurred in 2013, increased 5 times in the period since 2005 and projected up to 2020. They conclude the human contribution to the increased odds of the extreme event in the record hot summer was substantial. In a set of recent papers, Kevin Trenberth and his co-authors, as well as the unrelated group of Hannard et al., argued that climate scientists' approach to DNA studies should include a set of additional complementary methods. And here they are. Ted Shepard on the left bottom row and Kevin Trenberth on the bottom right. Shepard contrasts the now conventional risk-based approach with what he dubbed the storyline approach that seeks to explain the origins of singular events and the influence of climate change and other causes on those singular events. He describes the storyline approach as analogous to accident investigation, where multiple contributing factors are generally involved, and their roles are assessed in a conditional manner. This conditional approach is very general, and it can occur at a variety of levels, as Shepard emphasizes. He said that the most useful level of conditioning will depend on the question being asked. A storyline is a physically self-consistent unfolding of past events, like an autopsy of a plausible future events or pathways. There is no a priori probability of the storyline assessed. Instead, the emphasis is on understanding the driving factors and the plausibility of those factors, such as greenhouse effect. To illustrate the conditioned storyline approach, Trenberth and colleagues divide the representation of climate changes into two types: the dynamics of the atmosphere, such as large-scale motions like cyclonic storms or changes in the jet stream. You know, the weather map shows the jet stream. They're responsible for the placement of a given weather event at a given time. The problem is that these events are often difficult to discern, and the anthropogenic changes in the dynamics are often small and hard to attribute. Shepard published a paper in 2014 in which he was very critical of the accuracy of dynamics portions of climate models, and many agree with him. Thermodynamic changes, on the other hand, that is, changes in the heat and its effect on moisture content and rain, are easier to analyze and attribute. They're based on, for example, the basic physical law, the Clausius-Clapeyron relation, that tells us that as the air gets warmer, it will hold more moisture, which means that there can be more rain from the storm that's developing. This is an important relation that comes up with regard to hurricanes. In fact, the hurricane that's hitting the United States right now. The warmer the seawater is, the more water the hurricane holds. We saw Kevin Trenberth on TV News commenting on the expected floods in Texas based on this physical relation last year. For a given severe weather event, the storyline advocates suggest, given a case where we do not have a physically credible model that includes the dynamics, then under such conditions, it's better for event attribution to focus on the thermodynamics in event attribution. In such cases, we often set aside the question whether climate change altered atmospheric dynamics to make the storm type more likely for the moment. Instead, the idea is take the extreme event as a given constraint and then ask, are the thermodynamic factors involved in such a way to make it worse? In essence, they're proposing a conditional format. Given the atmospheric dynamics that brought about the event, how did climate change alter its impacts? One way to understand the differences between the risk-based and storyline approaches is to do a little bit of philosophy of science and focus on what I call the logic of research questions. This includes consideration of the relations between the research questions and their possible responsive and appropriate answers, as I've already hinted. For example, a research question under the storyline approach might be, given that the Boulder, Colorado flood of 2013 happened, how did climate change affect the severity of the flood, all other things being equal? Note that this research question assumes that the Boulder flood occurred where and when it did, and it also assumes that all the climate and weather dynamics associated with its occurrence. In other words, the research question simply assumes these facts, the causes of which are completely unknown. And the question is then the thermodynamic contribution of climate change and other causes to the severity of the event. On Trenberth et al. Suggested account, climate change led to increased water in the air, which was funneled into the Boulder flood from down south, increasing the amount of rainfall, thus the severity of the flood itself. That is a typical answer to a storyline extreme event question. It concerns the single event and some of its causes, including climate change and thermodynamics in the absence of adequate dynamical modeling. This is a very different research question from asking what is the probability or risk of a specific class of weather event given our world with global climate change relative to a world without global climate change. This question anticipates different possible answers, all of which involve classes or types of events, rather than singular events. But that logical fact is often forgotten by the users of the risk-based method, who tend also to answer in terms of singular events. One scientist who is unconvinced by the argument to reconsider scientific approaches to analyzing extreme events is Martin Herling of NOAA, the U.S. National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, a meteorologist who was responsible for the first study on the Boulder flood of 2013. He and his colleagues concluded there was no effect from global warming. If anything, they said climate change may have made the Boulder event less likely. The fact that Trenberth et al. In 2015 concluded that human effects did have an impact on the storm results confirms the point stressed by the National Academy of Sciences in the US. They said that the approach and framing, in my terms, the logical research questions of an attribution study may determine and affect its conclusions. In addition, Trenberth et al. Criticized the dynamical portion of Herling's models, saying they didn't have a high enough resolution or grid to make judgments about the amount of precipitation in the Boulder flood or model where it came from. This point was later taken up in a 2017 paper by Party Paul et al., who used a combination of risk-based and high-resolution storyline autopsy methods to give a mechanistic model for the flooding in Boulder. They conclude that greenhouse gas drivers increase the magnitude of heavy Colorado rainfall for the week by a flooding of 30%, using both risk-based and storyline models together. This is a lovely and very contemporary paper. It demonstrates what Shepard argues about the complementarity of the storyline and the risk-based accounts, using both to strengthen its results. So, from the vantage of history and philosophy of science, after this long introduction, very recently, a couple of the scientists, the idea that under conditions of secure knowledge, it's appropriate to attempt to explain causal pathways and mechanisms of individual events, especially when the dynamics of the situation may seem unavailable, seems entirely non-controversial. Now, I first learned of the storyline method from Kevin Trenberth when I was working as an affiliate scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and I thought it sounded reasonable. I wondered why the proposal had triggered such a negative and very emotional response, one that used the language of blame and failure in public discussions of the method online and in newspaper interviews and journals like Nature. And I learned that many scientists have not viewed it as a good thing. In fact, the proposal to adopt the storyline approach when knowledge of the dynamics was lacking has proved highly controversial. Clearly, there was a clash of large personalities, but there was also much more at stake. So I set out to investigate this, and meanwhile developed with my colleagues some ideas supporting an alternative approach compatible with Trenberth and Shepard's. One of the ideas that interested me was a Bayesian conditional approach, as suggested informally by Trenberth in 2011. In the 2014 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Fifth Assessment Report from the United Nations, the authors of the Working Group 2 DNA chapter mentioned the potential utility of a Bayesian approach, noting uncertainties may in some cases be further reduced, and so on, using a Bayesian approach. So in a new paper that came out last September, with climate science and hockey stick originator Michael Mann as the lead author, we presented an argument for the proof of concept for an alternative Bayesian approach, that is, a conditional Bayesian approach using a storyline approach. Now, this suggestion was thought so controversial by a leading journal in climate theory where we published it that they commissioned Peter Stott and his colleagues, David Caroli and Francis Weirs, to write a rebuttal and a commentary. We were thrilled to receive such a conciliatory commentary to move forward, although not without its critique, but with the view of the complementary nature of the two main approaches foremost in their minds. They do, however, continue to make one error that I'll discuss in a minute, and have yet to address the primary issue of values. And today I'll focus on a related matter. Why was the proposition to add a new approach to DNA studies, to pose and answer different research questions, so controversial? Why have scientists reacted so heatedly? When a new method is introduced into a scientific field, we would ordinarily expect lively discussion. But in fact, in this case, the response until now has generally been strongly negative and very value-laden. And I'm not going to address or repeat the more value-laden or personal attacks today. I'm not going to show them to you. But in general, one might expect that the community would acknowledge that Trenberth, Shepard, and colleagues have raised some serious and significant questions and proposals. At minimum, one might expect a discussion addressing the pros and the cons of changing default assumptions, or of the feasibility of replacing or adding on conventional approaches with conditional ones. But this is not the primary thing that happened. While some scientists responded positively, the dominant response of scientists within the DNA community has been strongly negative. Substantive discussions of DNA opposed to Trenberth and Shepard have been offered by a group led by Peter Stott, Gabriel Hegel, Freddie Otto, and Miles Allen at Oxford, and leaders in DNA at Oxford. Most centrally, and this appears to be their most forceful objection, these scientists criticize the storyline account and suggestion to focus on thermodynamic aspects of climate change on the grounds that this would give an incomplete and potentially misleading picture. They say, while climate models appear to capture thermodynamic changes well, they may struggle to simulate circulation, and that's dynamics. In light of these difficulties, it could be decided to ignore dynamical changes and concentrate instead on how human-induced thermodynamic changes have affected extremes. However, they say many event attribution studies consider how the probability of an event is changing. This forces consideration of both dynamical and thermodynamic influences, because both can play a role in the changing probability of an event. Now, these authors stress that dynamical effects can work in both directions, potentially making certain kinds of event less likely, so one cannot simply set them aside. But logically, I think we must consider the following facts. First, the storyline approach is proposed to be applied when we do not know or have confidence in the dynamical effects. So no one is ignoring them. Rather, they're not available or adequate in these cases. And I'm concerned about the logic of the second line of argument. Stott and Otto and others have offered a set of counterexamples to the storyline methods that supposedly pose a serious challenge. These DNA scientists recite case after case after case in which some dynamical models are available in that case that seem to mitigate or go against the direction of the thermodynamic effect. These are indeed cases in which dynamics seems to make a difference to the thermodynamic outcome. The challenge from Trenberth et al. And Shepard is whether these dynamics are at all plausible or reliable. That's the point of arguing that we should rely more heavily on thermodynamic modeling. Thus, the claim that there are several dynamical models that go against the direction of the thermodynamical model ignores the objection that many dynamical models are inadequate. So offering these dynamical models as counterexamples ignores the basic objections that discredit many dynamical models as inadequate or not credible. So why should we treat these counterexample dynamical models as more adequate than most? Has this question even been addressed by the opponents? Without showing that the dynamical models they proffered are more credible than the dynamical models against which the objections have been lodged, they're begging the question. They're assuming what needs to be shown. This logical situation has remained unnoticed by the climate scientists involved in this debate on both sides. But it's a simple logical problem. Take the number of models that include the dynamics essentially, all opposing the thermodynamics. Logically, without establishing the veracity and empirical support of these models they cite, which are under challenge, the DNA authors cannot use them as evidence against the storyline authors, Trentworth and Shepard. In fact, defenders of the risk-based approach never confront the basic complaint about the unreliability of dynamical models directly, even though this point lies at the foundation of the storyline approach. Moreover, the DNA authors have not shown that these models are not the exceptions and in fact represent a fair sample of cases and so on. But in their critique and rebuttal solicited to comment on our Man et al. Paper in climate change, Peter Stott and Caroli and Zweers argued that our proposed priors, which allowed for climate change influence, could be wrong in a given case, and they demonstrated the wrongness of our priors through listing a series of 4 modeling efforts of cases in which the dynamics went in opposition to the thermodynamics, a situation logically identical to the argument we've just been discussing. They wrote, given that changes locally can be very different to global expectations as a result of, for example, dynamically induced changes overcoming thermodynamically induced ones, and there you have it right there. Great care must be taken using prior expectations and so on. Describing, it assumes what needs to be shown. Yet they want a very strong conclusion. And
is it social evidence? Is it scientific evidence?
oh, yes.
Have they more evidence than dynamical models?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yes, the storyline models tend to have scientific evidence. They have evidence from models and from data. So they use both data, they use evidence from data and individual causal evidence, and they use evidence from models, both, and thermodynamic models. They tend not to use evidence from dynamical models, the dynamical portion of the models. They use evidence from thermodynamic portion of the models, and they use evidence from data. Sometimes they do use dynamical portion of the models if it has good evidence for it, if it is well supported. So it depends on each individual occurrence, what the evidence is, but it's all scientific evidence. It's empirical evidence. It's empirical evidence and empirical and climate modeling.
Thank you
Yes.
very much. Давайте поблагодарим еще раз докладчика и за вопросы. Коллеги, сейчас будет объявление. Прошу минуточку внимания.
Oh, thank you.
Я хотел бы рассказать поподробнее о сегодняшнем дне. Сейчас у нас наступает время обеда. Специально для вас мы зарезервировали обеды в ресторане «Русское зарубежье». У каждого у вас в сумочке имеется схема прохода. Обед стоит 350 рублей. Я вас уверяю, это лучший вариант, если вы вообще хотите обедать. Я не рекомендую направляться к нам в буфет. Там будет немножко менее интересно, меньше. И, конечно, не такое обслуживание заранее. Обращаю ваше внимание на то, что постарались с ними договориться о достойном обеде для вас. Это первое. Обед будет длиться до 2 часов. Вы можете приобретать талоны, вы можете просто так направляться туда, без всяких талонов. Разницы никакой. Тогда будет оплата на месте. В 2 часа начинаются заседания секций и круглых столов по программе. Если есть изменения, то Татьяна Соколова может сейчас их озвучить. Татьяна, будете озвучивать изменения? У нас есть изменения какие-то? Вот. После этого, после того, как закончатся секции, у нас будет приглашенная лекция. Докладчик другой, потому что Вячеслав Семенович Степин, к сожалению, по ряду личных обстоятельств не может присутствовать. Владимир Натанович Порус выступит таким лектором. В промежутке секционных заседаний и круглых столов планируется кофе-брейк на втором этаже в 4, правильно я говорю? В 4 часа дня. Да, пожалуйста, Татьяна, значит, какие-то дополнительные сообщения.
Коллеги, подсекция 2, секция 2, история науки полностью переносится на сегодняшний день. Завтра в МГУ докладов не будет. Мы повесим изменения на входе около вахты.